Thank you all for coming to this federal policy, legislative, administrative prospects for reform session, for the breakout session. My name's Scott Seder. I've been working in the industry since 2013. I'm a former prosecutor. I'm a former regulator. I've worked with companies and clients in the THC state authorized space, and then also in the what I call the hemp cannabis space as well. And right now I'm teaching at the University of Texas School of Law, the first ever cannabis law class that I created, and this is the second year, and I'm enjoying that. And I'm happy to be moderating this discussion with some esteemed colleagues that have a lot of experience. And what we hope to accomplish today is talk to you all about some of the things that are going on at the federal level that are influencing policy, and whether that be through rulemaking or legislation. And we look forward to having some good questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to let each of my esteemed colleagues come up and give a brief introduction, and I'll let them introduce themselves, explain their background, and tell you all a little bit about what they want to discuss. And then we'll sort of get into it from there. So Bryon, why don't you start? Why don't you come up, and I know you have a slideshow. You can introduce yourself and then explain what you think is important for our audience to learn today.
Okay, I'm Bryon Adinoff. I am actually no longer president of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation because we changed the name last year to Doctors for Drug Policy Reform, which I've changed everywhere on our website and everywhere else except on my first slide. My career was in academia. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, and I did primarily neuroimaging work in people with substance use disorders. I've always had a thing for drug policy reform. And once I retired from the Veterans Hospital and University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas, where I spent most of my career, I could say whatever I wanted. So that's what I'm doing now. And I moved to Denver from Dallas 6 years ago. Cannabis is just not that big of a deal up there. Once we got past legalizing it. And I'm editor-in-chief of the American Journal on Drug and Alcohol Abuse. I'm a consultant for Demorex and Atai Life Sciences, which are both involved in studying ibogaine for use in addictions. And I've done some work for the Badger Institute. As I mentioned, Doctors for Cannabis Regulation was started in 2015, and it evolved into Doctors for Drug Policy Reform. It's a group of licensed health professionals and scientists advocating for evidence-based drug policies and best practices that advance public health, reduce stigma, and minimize harm. So just some key notes in terms of federal prohibition. 1851, cannabis was in the third edition of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. 1932 was when the Uniform Narcotic Drug Act was started. And this allowed states to regulate or ban the sale or possession of cannabis. 1937 was the Marijuana Tax Act, and that's when marijuana was effectively outlawed, the grow, sale, and possession. And then in 1969, the Marijuana Tax Act was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. Nixon assigned the Schaefer Commission to look at the dangers and evils of cannabis. They did not do as instructed, and they said that marijuana should not have criminal sanctions for private possession or use. And in 1972, President Nixon oversaw the development of the Controlled Substances Act, Substance Use Act, which considered cannabis as Schedule I. So the CSA is what it's usually called, as an acronym. It has Schedule I, which has drugs that have no currently accepted medical use. CAMU is for currently accepted medical use, a high potential for abuse, and lack of accepted safety. So that would include drugs like heroin, LSD, marijuana, psilocybin, and ibogaine. Schedule 2 are drugs that do have currently accepted use or high in abuse potential. And these would be drugs like fentanyl, Dilaudid, oxycodone, and methamphetamine. So basically opioids and meth. Schedule 3 are drugs like amphetamine, methylphenidate, anabolic steroids. So it goes from 1 to 5, and essentially 3 is not as bad as 2, and 4 is not as bad as 3, and 5 is not as bad as 4. And that is pretty literally how they are defined. So there is no clear set criteria. So cannabis is now Schedule 1. That's in the wrong spot. Cannabis rescheduled, as we will talk about it, is being proposed at Schedule 3. And where we'd like to see, most of us would like to see it anyways, is descheduled, which means not on the CSA at all. So to terms we'll use that are often unclear are decriminalized, which is removal of criminal sanctions. So Congress can decriminalize it. So for instance, in Colorado, many psychedelics are now decriminalized. They are not legalized. There's no regulatory framework for cultivating or producing them. There's no regulation for commerce, distribution, or for sale. Okay, but decriminalized just mean there's no criminal sanctions. There could be a civil fine. Rescheduling means we could go from 1 to 3 or 2 or 5 within the CSA, and descheduling is removing it from the CSA schedule, which essentially for marijuana or cannabis would be decriminalizing it. Now, why D4 DPR? We've written a position paper on why rescheduling is presently being discussed is not sufficient. First of all, rescheduling cannabis to Schedule 3, it won't be Schedule 1 anymore, so it's acknowledging it has medical use, currently medical use, but what it doesn't do, the FDA still has to approve a specific cannabis compound. So there's only 2 cannabis compounds right now that have been approved, dronabinol and nabilone. If you're not one of those, it's still illegal. Everything you see in a dispensary is still going to be illegal. And the fines won't be as great as a Schedule 1, but there's still going to be penalties. So it won't make any difference in that respect. So to make it not criminal, we need to deschedule. Rescheduling even to Schedule 5 is not sufficient. So in order for the cannabis that you all use here in Texas, it's all, unless you're using Marinol or Nabilone, it's still going to be federally illegal if the FDA hasn't approved it. It's not going to do that much for research. I can go into that on Q&A. And it's not going to change the state law. So it's only, I guess you can think of it like abortion. I said I wasn't going to bring up that word here, but it's still going to leave it up to the states to decide what they want to do. If it's legal, I just said it's all going to be illegal anyways, but no matter what the state does, that's going to stand, and it's not going to change anything in the state. And what we believe in DPR, we're going to need a separate regulatory system. The Tobacco and Alcohol Bureau, TTB, or the FDA are not sufficient to regulate cannabis. It's too different. It's not only has recreational use, it has medical use. So this is going to be something we can discuss more here. Yeah, let me just mention the federal legislation presently being discussed. Again, we can go into more detail. There's 3 bills looking at descheduling the CAOA, the MORE Act that has been approved twice in the in the House, and the sponsor, Representative Nadler, in the House. The sponsor initially was at the time, Senator Kamala Harris, and the SRA. And Lisa's going to talk more about that, the States Reform Act. There's others bills, Prepare Act, sponsored by Representative Joyce and Senator Hickenlooper. And this is going to deal with what I was saying earlier. We need a whole different system, because these other 3 laws, these other 3 bills are saying, well, we need to do something different with regulation, but no one's really figured out what that is. My issue with the Prepare Act is it's as if it was written by the alcohol company, and it may have been. So there's none of you all on it, on this panel. They're government people who have been fighting off legalization for decades, and there's people from industry. There's no advocacy. There's no medical presence there. And I think Lisa's going to talk about the States and SAFER Act. That's her wheelhouse. And let me finish just mentioning the IICPS, the International Intoxicating Product Symbol. This was designed by David Nathan, who was the founder and first president of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. It has been approved by ASTM, which is one of the big standardization organizations in the world, like United Laboratories. And I've got some information when you first walk in the door, some stickers and things. It's been approved in 4 states so far. We would like to see this approved everywhere, because when we get to the point of interstate commerce, we don't have to worry about how it's all going to be identified. We've got it. Actually, globally, we've got it. Thank you.
All right. Lisa, would you like to?
Well, I don't have a presentation, so
That's okay.
I could just sit here and
This
talk.
is a conversation.
Right.
This is just a friendly conversation.
My name's Lisa Pittman. I'm an attorney in Austin. My law firm's Pittman Legal, and I've been practicing law in this area for almost 10 years. I got involved in 2015 when I read the Compassionate Use Act, and when I read about what the mothers' lives were like, taking care of their children, and how they would need to leave the state or their families, schools, and churches to go seek treatment for their child in another state, or maybe they didn't have the resources to do so. And so that's when I got involved, and I moved to Colorado for a couple of years, and that was under the 2014 Farm Bill, when hemp was still marijuana, and like we're back there again. And also that was in the heyday of marijuana legalization. So at that time, we only had 2 legal states for recreational. It was Colorado and Washington. And it was super exciting because it was the first days of legalization, the first time that anybody was stepping out and doing this federally illegal thing. And like you said, even if there's a state law allowing you to go buy marijuana in a dispensary, that's still illegal federally. And then I came back to Texas in 2019, getting the hemp law passed, and I represent businesses all the way up and down the supply chain, marijuana, hemp in Texas and in the surrounding states.
Lisa, when you see federal efforts, both in the Congress and rescheduling, how do you believe any of these efforts could affect the people here that may own Texas businesses that are licensed or ancillary to licensees?
Well, the efforts we're talking about right now probably aren't going to help Texas businesses for a little while. So if we're talking about rescheduling marijuana from 1 to 3, that puts it into a category that the doctor can explain a little bit more how that's going to work, but how you need to get a prescription, or you need to go get that from a provider or some type of a pharmacy, compounding pharmacy, or something like that. So it's going to be a little bit different situation. And that only applies to 3 companies in Texas, the 3 Texas compassionate use companies. Everybody else selling cannabis in Texas is hemp, and that's already federally legal. Hemp has been removed from the definition of marijuana. So all of these issues don't really play into the hemp that we're selling in Texas.
Well, this is if you ever get asked to be on a panel, I have the best job because I'm just a moderator. So I get to ask all the good questions and not be the subject matter expert, which is a lot more fun, just FYI. So in this case, Doctor, if you were going to look at rescheduling and the efforts in the light most favorable to the government, what do you think it does do? What signal does it send? How could it be perceived among anyone in this audience as a positive thing for the industry as a whole? Tough, huh?
It is tough. We were actually, Deeper DPR was going to come out against rescheduling because the concern is that it's going to be seen as a step, and President Biden would say, okay, look at all I've done. You've got your win, and just not bother with it. And there's been a lot of concern within the advocates that I've been involved in, whether to support it is a minor step, it's something, and to take it, and don't give the DEA the opportunity to say, well, the advocates don't want it anyways. They want descheduling, and that's not what you asked us to do, so never mind. They're just looking for an excuse to shoot it down. So we went ahead and said, if only to hopefully help out the industry to get the 280E tax business, the business tax deductions, that, yeah, let's go ahead, support it, but then we added in all these other things. And we've asked to speak at the administrative hearing so we can make the point descheduling won't really be an option there, but at least say make it 4 or 5, which may make a little difference. But it's not that helpful. I would add that again, only FDA-approved medication are going to be considered Schedule 3. They say cannabis, but presently there are no cannabis products, flower, that are approved as Schedule 3 or as FDA-approved medication. And personally, I don't think it's going to happen. Each of the FDA-approved molecules so far are single molecules. They have not, even though they have a division of plant medicine, none have been approved. And there's been hundreds and hundreds that have been proposed. That's not something they do. Maybe they will, but I think we need a new system before that happens.
Well, Lisa, I know that you said, and everyone here knows there's only 3 licensees and Teacup, but of course there are many other businesses across the United States that are state authorized to sell THC, whether that's through a robust medical program or adult use. How important is 280E in the ability for these businesses to make ordinary business deductions to the survival of the industry as a whole and maybe those businesses?
I'd say it's the most important thing, probably, because of it being Schedule 1, there's a tax code provision that says if you're trafficking in a controlled substance of 1 or 2, you cannot deduct any of your ordinary business expenses. So they have like less than grocery store margins. They also have to comply with incredibly burdensome taxation, other state taxes, regulation, a lot of other things. There's some other issues that we'll probably talk about, that, marijuana companies, because of the Schedule 1, don't have access to banking, mortgages, credit, any kind of financial services, credit card processing. So there are a lot of other dominoes that are going to need to fall, and some other laws that are going to need to change as well.
And Doctor, appreciate the position of the organization, but isn't it something at all that it's the first time that I'm aware of that the federal government, in the backdrop of prohibition, has acknowledged that cannabis could have some use for people?
Yeah, it's a big deal. And HHS did that, and I'm glad they did. It's appropriate. But so there's good things about it. Just that acknowledgement is probably the biggest deal of all. But so for instance, Lisa, even though 280E will not be relevant to cannabis, to me it's unclear whether they're talking only about FDA-approved medications, or does it apply to all of cannabis?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either because, I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, but I think it's extremely significant. So in the talk I gave earlier, I talked about an amicus brief that I submitted against the DEA in 2020. For, over 50 years, we've been petitioning the DEA to reschedule, and they won't reschedule because they'll say, well, there's no scientific research. But as a Schedule I substance, you're not allowed to do any scientific research. So they always had their little excuse right there. And so I think it's momentous that for the first time after all these years of fighting, they are finally, so President Biden asked the HHS, Health and Human Services, to evaluate whether marijuana should be rescheduled. And so part of that evaluation was them looking at all of the medical use that currently exists. And they gave some credence to that. And they analyzed the risk of abuse. And based on that analysis, they've proposed that let's move this down to Schedule 3, which I think is hugely historic. Of course, we don't want it on the schedule at all, but that's huge. Finally, they're saying, yes, there's some medical use. It should be researched more. And the risk of abuse is kind of low. So that's a huge breakthrough too.
So doctor, in the backdrop of Schedule 3, let's assume for the sake of this conversation that it goes through after hearing. Do you think the government is going to need to create a regulatory framework around that? Because that's not really a whole solution. And if you do, explain a little more about why you believe the TTB is the appropriate regulator, because folks in the audience may have an entity or want an entity or understand that. That would be super helpful.
I did not think TTB would be.
Okay, well then what government, when you answer the question, you insert in blank what you think the appropriate regulator should be.
As I said, I like the Prepare Act because it was suggesting we need a new framework. I don't think any of our frameworks, they should be, because cannabis is both recreational and a medicinal. So being those two, we don't have anything that it nicely fits into. We don't have any good system for evaluating botanicals. As I said, we don't have any botanicals approved as FDA medication. That's not where their mindset is. Their mindset, understandably, is on a single molecule, and it has to be, so when you go to the pharmacy and get a prescription, that molecule is exactly the same as if you were in Washington and went to a pharmacy. It's going to be exactly the same molecule. So it's always going to be exactly the same. You can't do that with a plant. Even with exactly the same growing conditions, humidity, genetics, everything's the same. They're still going to be a little bit different. So we do not have a system that deals with that. Germany does. So Germany does this kind of thing, but we do not. So I think we're going to need a unique system to deal with botanicals that also allows for them being used not as medicine as well. So let me stop there.
So what you're suggesting is a complete overhaul that would create a regulatory framework for cannabinoids just in general, including THC.
Yeah.
That's sort of what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't, I said for this simple, for the single molecules, say you're going for a CBG, specific type of CBG or a terpene, you can still go through the regular FDA process. That if you want to sell a single molecule, but when you get into the plant is where we run into something different.
But in a regular FDA process, you have to file a new, it's either a supplement or an ingredient or it's grass. So don't those things take years to get approved?
Yeah, that's why I think we need a regular system that's not going to require this, because right now it costs about $1 billion to get a drug approved. And how many chemo bars out there that you're going to have anybody with $1 billion, much less more than a couple chemo bars, you're not going to have them approved by the FDA. I mean, who's got that kind of money and the time? And this is for one type of administration. So if you do it for an oral administration, if you want to do it as inhale a flower or a vape, those are completely different submissions to the FDA. Some
of these issues have been considered in the States Reform Act that I wanted to tell you all about. This was put forward by Nancy Mace. And I really like what she's come up with this. It's called the Strengthening the 10th Amendment Through Entrusting States. So it removes marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act altogether and ends criminalization, sets up a regulatory system to be led by the states. It defers the prohibition and commercial regulation to the states. But on this topic of what agency, what I like about what she's come up with is marijuana would be treated like an alcohol crop and regulated by the USDA. So like hops and barley. The TTB would do interstate regulation of it like alcohol. ATF would do the law enforcement. There'd be a safe harbor for patients, 21 and up. They would grandfather existing licenses and some existing products. The FDA would not be allowed to prohibit the approval of new drugs. It would allow SBA loans, have only a 3% tax and a moratorium on new taxes for 10 years, have alcohol record keeping. So there are some other things out there where they are trying to come up with some already other existing agencies to see if we could move some of these aspects into a bucket that's a little bit more appropriate for this unique product that kind of straddles a couple of different categories.
That's a great point. In a states' rights model, you're going to have some interstate commerce. Do either of you see issues for businesses in such a world where interstate commerce is permitted? Now, I know the businesses today that have operations in multiple states, their issues are they can't move product from one state to another, and in addition to many problems that exist for federal prohibition. But do either of you see issues that could be created by, let's say, the flick of a switch, allowing interstate commerce?
I see an issue that could be resolved. So right now, as Scott's saying, because marijuana is Schedule I, it has to be contained within a state's borders. It's under the pleasure of that state's law. So when you see a marijuana company that's in 17 different states, those are 17 different companies that have licensed the branding. They have to keep everything within one state. They have to grow in each state, extract everything. So if with a flick of a switch, maybe they could just grow in Humboldt or South Carolina, whichever is more economical, and then just ship it. Maybe the best extractions in Houston, they can do that there. So you won't have to have 50 different silos of your operations. That'll be huge.
But what about my labels? What about my labels? If every state has a different label requirement, or they may have different milligram requirements, or they may have a million different things, how do I get those efficiencies in interstate commerce? Or what about the fact that, we spent $5 million creating a facility that's GMP-like in one state, and allegedly, purportedly, there's certain states on the West Coast that have enough cannabis to feed the world if it desired. Right. What happens then to the industry?
I mean, it's definitely going to be a huge reshuffling. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of huge capital investments that, what are we going to do there? The different labelings. So it's going to depend on what form this takes. Do we get a national regulatory system where labels for products that are in interstate commerce have to meet certain requirements? That's uniform. That's what I would like to see, something uniform for both hemp and marijuana. My comment to the DEA on the rescheduling was, let's treat this more like codeine, where, if it's straight up codeine, it's a higher schedule. If it's just a little bit with Tylenol, then it's much lower and easier to get. But wherever you buy that codeine, you know that it's been tested the same and that it's going to have the same effectiveness and that it's going to be safe and so forth. So I hope that we get some national standards out of this rescheduling.
So maybe during this breakout, we'll come up with those standards. You can start. I think that's perfect.
I've been in a lot of conversations like this. We've never come up with much.
Have some optimism. Come on.
I don't, being back from Texas, I'm not too optimistic here. So in terms of interstate, well, let me mention, I mentioned earlier that there are two other bills. So that would deschedule, and they're both very good in expungement. Two are being proposed by Democrats, and the one Lisa mentioned is being proposed by a Republican. is Don Lyman, who wrote Prop 64, told me the best bill is the one that can get passed. Now, the Democrats' bills have more on social justice, community investment, research than the SRA does. But from my personal perspective, if it gets descheduled and there's expungement, then I'm happy. Others won't be as much. In terms of interstate commerce, the biggest concern about that is not just having 3 MSOs, multi-state operators. And that's the way our economy typically goes. And so I think at least the CAOA has some things dealing with that, and it's not my area. But those are kind of the details that maybe distinguish one bill from the other.
Well, I want to switch back to rescheduling because to me, that was the most significant thing to happen in cannabis since the Cole memo, like momentous in terms of that acknowledgement. I read the newspaper. I heard there's a hearing on December 2nd. What do you expect to happen at that hearing in terms of folks that might be able to show up with standing and what those folks might say and how those comments or that testimony might be received?
So, first of all, what someone who's done a lot of these has told me, it probably won't be December 2nd just because it changes. It seemed unfortunate and probably purposeful that it's being done after the election. And I haven't been involved in one of these, but my understanding is you're going to have both sides. There'll be some hot tubbing that I guess you guys know about. The term was used where the question is asked to both sides. So Sam will be there, and then folks like us will be there. And
Sam, did you?
Smart approaches for marijuana. Kevin Sabet.
What's that organization's position on cannabis reform?
That it is the Kevin Sabet. He was at the University of Berkeley. He's probably closer to my age. He was against cannabis at the University of California, Berkeley. And he has been against cannabis ever since. And this is all he does, is fights cannabis. And he made a career of it. So this is what they do. And I imagine he'll be there and his people will be there. So anytime you hear a group coming out against cannabis vehemently, he's probably involved, or Sam is involved. You'll notice the name now if you weren't aware of it. So there'll be people like him. There'll be probably some medical organizations, unfortunately, opposing it. And hopefully there'll be a bunch of advocates like us who you need to ask to be, you need to send the DEA a request to be there.
No, I think in your opening comments, you said you weren't sure, or I don't want to misquote you weren't optimistic that it would go through. Is that a fair characterization of your comments? I know it's a guess.
I don't think that's, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do. DEA does not want to approve it. I mean, the HHS was strong-armed by the administration to push the DEA to do it. And in fact, the Department of Justice, who oversees the DEA, they're the ones that signed off on it. And Milgram, who's head of the DEA, she did not sign off on it. So I think they will use any trick up their sleeve. I mean, there's still 30% of drug arrests in this country are for cannabis. They don't want to lose that.
Do you think it might make a difference that both candidates for president have signaled support for this rescheduling?
It depends, which is so cool. I mean, we have 2 presidential candidates from both parties, both saying that they support cannabis legalization. To me, that's a really big deal. I think I don't know how the government works that well, but I suspect if the president says, I want this to happen, then they can make it happen.
Okay. Well, circling back to, something that Lisa talked about is like whether or not that's going to matter for Texas businesses. I think it's important in this conference that we make that a focal point. And I'm super interested in hearing from each of you what type of federal reform, whether it be through rulemaking or rescheduling or legislation, that would have the biggest impact on the cannabis industry in Texas, where it sits? Always appreciating that. We know it's a creature of the state legislature, but even just from a signaling point of view, is there any federal legislation or policy objectives you've seen discussed that you think if it were enacted, it would move policymakers here or would benefit, other than 280E, of course, with rescheduling, Texas businesses?
Safer banking, that affects everybody. And I think that if banks and financial service providers and insurance companies and all of the different companies, regulated entities that are included in that, if they are permitted without penalty to serve these businesses, I think that starts to make more of the business case, which then, sheds some more stigma, brings us more into regular business commerce to get more of the attention and legitimacy from the legislature.
And we talked a little bit about the backdrop of, it's not a secret, a lot of cannabis businesses are struggling. And one of the biggest problems is there's really a lack of capital that's being pushed into these businesses. In the last several years, it seems that more of these businesses have lost money than have made money. And as a result, there's not a ton of investor enthusiasm. And as someone like all of us have been around for a long time, it's not an industry that's seen as a growth industry to many. And there are fewer opportunities that are meaningful in the business to get involved. One of the key issues would be institutional lending. One of the biggest problems is a lot of these businesses can't get traditional loans. And as a result, a lot of these businesses, they enter into an agreement if they own the dirt, if they own real estate, where they have to lease back, or they get terms that are hard money lender terms, meaning like 13 to 16% interest rates. Outside of that, are there any other things so safer banking would solve those two things, that employees could get paid, and theoretically, depending on how the language would be drafted, they couldn't even use debit and credit at some point. And there could be a version that would be allow for institutional lending so that these commercial businesses could get rates that are commercially reasonable. Are there any other things that you would see on the federal horizon that could be helpful?
Do you know about the States' Rights Act? So it's, from my understanding, it's different than the States Reform Act, which we were talking about earlier. The States' Rights Act, as I understand it, is similar to the Safer Banking Act, except it applies to the non-banking stuff. So anything that anything that's an issue about cannabis within a state or within the federal government, we're going to let it pass for states that have legalized cannabis. I think that would be a really big deal. Kind of like the Cole memo that says the Department of Justice can't intrude on states that are following their own laws about cannabis. So it would be kind of like that. I did want to mention something else about Schedule 3 that my understanding it would do. Is there something called the FinCEN, financial centralized, something like that? And I found out that recently found out that there is a laws that were put into place to help out cannabis businesses that said banks can loan money or let people open a checking account as long as you keep careful track, since they're cannabis companies, as long as you keep careful track of all their finances and make sure they're doing the right thing. Well, the bank said, oh my God, we don't want to do this. This is too much of a headache. So we're just not going to let any of them open accounts, which is why when we were Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, we couldn't get a checking account because it had cannabis in the name. So they just, rather than say, well, let's figure out how we can help these folks out, they just said, we're just not going to deal with any of them. So hopefully that will change with Schedule 3.
I do have something else to say about Texas. This rescheduling period is going to be great for Texas next session because as independent as we are, we follow the feds. So the reason why we didn't do the 2014 pilot program was because hemp was still considered marijuana back then. So it wasn't until the 2018 Farm Bill, with hemp being removed from the definition of marijuana, that Texas was willing to go ahead and let's give this a shot. It really pays attention to the feds and what the other southern states are doing. So I think that, with a rescheduling, with it coming off of Schedule 1 down to Schedule 3, that sounds more like medicine. A lot of the southern states are really coming along. Florida's big in the news. Florida and Louisiana both started very modest programs at the same time Texas did. And both of them have now, run circles around us. So I think that next session, all of these things are going to converge to create, that greater cultural, maybe impetus to get some better laws in 2025, now that it's becoming less of the devil's lettuce at the federal level.
And do either of you think that rescheduling it will have, even if it's not decriminalizing cannabis, do you think it will have any impact on the way that law enforcement views cannabis if it's rescheduled?
Yeah, I think most law enforcement, they are just enforcing the laws they are told to enforce, and they don't have much personal opinion about it. So if it is, made known that this is a lesser enforcement priority and it is no longer Schedule 1, our own Controlled Substances Act is going to have to be modified as well. And that's going to, impact how law enforcement acts.
Do you have any? It's okay if you don't.
I don't know if it's much of a priority presently for law enforcement. When I've been to congressional, state legislative hearings, usually they say it's a way for them to pick out the bad guys. So they smell it, then they can search the car. So they use it as an excuse to search a car. And I think if it's Schedule 3, they'll still, I don't know why they wouldn't use it, because cannabis is still not going to be legal under Schedule 3.
Do you think it's possible, even if it's unlikely, that when it's rescheduled, if it gets rescheduled, that they Frankenstein the rules in some weird way, that it could become a prescription model, even though there's adult use in some states? Is that possible, do you think, or does that seem impossible?
I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it would take a unique regulatory approach. Perhaps what you're saying, talking about TTB or another approach, but it would have to come from the feds, and it would be something new.
Could you argue that if rescheduling goes through, it might force the federal government's their hand to address it and to actually create a model? Because it's one thing where you have federal prohibition and state authorization. There's another thing where you have a form of federal authorization that doesn't jibe completely with state authorization. Do you think that's possible, that it could become a higher priority?
My approach is that I think it's impossible. 20 years ago, I would have told you it's impossible for us to have legal dispensaries in most states in the country. So I'm probably not a good person to ask. I'm gonna, most of what we're doing is, I live in Denver. I have 2 dispensaries where I can get whatever I want, 2 blocks away. It boggles my mind every time I go in. I grew up in the 60s. So this is all amazing to me. So anything could happen, and hopefully it does.
I think it could force their hand. So some of these bills that we've talked about, the federal legislation, have made it through maybe the Democratic House, but they get stopped in the Senate. But, there's all this fervor, but it's still kind of special interest. So if it is moved down from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, then maybe there'll be more reason to go ahead and push one of these through, such as the safer banking or a regulatory framework, such as the States Reform Act, to house this substance that is being downgraded from illegal for any purpose. So possibly.
So a lot of these acts that we've discussed, they've been bandied around the Congress for years and years. Do either of you know, has there been any political consequence for the Congress's failure to act on any of these acts? Have people lost elections? Has there been any price to pay?
None.
None federally. I'm trying to think on a state, though. I don't know that anyone's lost, but I know that there has been people, Hickenlooper's an excellent example from Colorado, who is very much against it. He has changed his tune and now is sponsoring one of these pieces of legislation. So I know people have responded to what's happened. Actually, consequence, Mississippi. Again, it's not federal, but the Mississippi Supreme Court struck down for some technical reason the medical cannabis bill that got passed overwhelmingly by their population. And they struck it down, and there was a concerted effort to have everyone who voted against it recalled. And the legislature freaked out and didn't want all these folks recalled. So they figured out a way to work out a compromise so it passed through the legislature. So there can be pressure brought to the political machine by the populace that works.
In my experience, a long time ago, working in lobbying and legislatures, there was always a champion in both houses in the legislature that would stand up for a cause. I'm going to open this up to the whole room. Can anyone in this room identify a congressional champion of cannabis reform? Is there anybody? I see Heather in the back.
Yes.
Are there any others? Anyone in the Senate? Is there any senator?
Oh, Schumer, Booker, the ones who sponsored the CAOA.
So would it be fair for the collective us to be looking to them, whether it be during lame duck or the next congressional session?
And actually, Sessions, he was in my district in Arlington. I forget his first name, not Jeff. Pete Sessions. And he was targeted because he was holding things up in the House. I think he was House Ways and Means Committee. He was in the way. And I know the guy was tasked with, all he had to get a change was 2% of the vote. And he was going after the libertarians and the stoners. And it switched, he got enough to switch that Sessions lost his seat. So that was a direct consequence of his getting in the way of any progress on cannabis.
Isn't he back in though?
Pardon?
No.
I hate to throw a wrench in this, but I know in some states that have the mature states with mature markets, they have a ton of jobs in these states. And they have a ton of government programs that are promoting these jobs, sometimes with taxpayer dollars. The governors of those states may or may not be pleased with interstate commerce because theoretically, as we discussed, states that have a massive amount of cannabis to ship across the United States could wipe those businesses out and all those programs. Do you see a tension that could be resolved? Do you think there's a way that maybe there could be some form of legalization that doesn't necessarily hurt some of the states and the programs that they have? Lisa?
As I mentioned earlier, that there are aspects of bills that, I mean, you're absolutely right. California has 4 times as much cannabis to export as they can use in the state. And there are aspects of interstate commerce that have been proposed, I think in either the CAOA or the MORE. Shannon Title with Parabola is the go-to person for that. But I don't know the specifics, and I don't know that it's truly possible just because of the way our economy works.
In the dormant commerce clause and whether or not you can ship across, or you could prohibit.
What is, tell me, I hear that a lot, but what is that?
That would prohibit the the barring of states from shipping one product to another state, what if it's federally legal? That's a short version of it. We're running closer to the end on our time. I want to ask each of you or whoever wants to take this question. I read in the newspaper that there is an election for the president of the United States coming up. I don't know if any of you have seen that. I am interested in knowing what statements these candidates have made, or even those that may have held this office before of the president of the United States, and what differences we might expect or could expect in an approach on cannabis. Anybody?
Who's going first? You go first.
Show our colors, I think, a little bit, but I'll speak for Harris, and she put a lot of people away, from what I understand, in California as Attorney General for cannabis, which is not to her credit, as far as I'm concerned. She did sponsor this MORE Act, one of the bills to deschedule cannabis. While she was in the Senate, she has spoken overtly about legalizing cannabis. A few months ago, she did that. She recently had a webpage that showed all her position statements. To many of our disappointment, she did not talk about cannabis. I think more important is the party. The Dems have passed the MORE Act twice. And if you look at how to get cannabis legalized in a state, you either need to let the citizens decide by ballot initiative or have a Democratic legislature. And that was mentioned this morning, that Republicans legislatures have not legalized cannabis. I think that is, and again, the States' Rights Act, the Reform Act, is proposed by Nancy Mace. We have a Republican majority in the House, but it hasn't been voted on. So I'll leave it there.
Lisa?
Sure. So, well, as far as it depends on what your state you're in, whether, it would be beneficial to have a Republican or a Democrat. Like, for example, here in Texas, if a Democrat, well, we have Democrats put forth legalization bills and they won't go anywhere. And I think that's one of the problems at the federal level. And another reason why I'm excited about a Republican sponsoring, because Republicans, I don't know, seem to kind of be in control sometimes. And so I think that needs to be played to as well. But as far as President Trump, to me, he's always been consistent, even when he was on the campaign trail before 2016, that he believed in medical and he viewed it as a states' right issue. And then while he was president, 13 states, I'm sorry, 8 of them were medical and 5 of them were recreational. Is that me? Or that's
No, that's me.
So, he took a very, hands-off approach. So there was a lot of exponential legalization that happened during his presidency. And then he's been on the campaign trail again, and same thing. He's just been consistent with the same treatment that he gave it while he was president. And so now recently we have the Florida law where he says he supports that, and he's coming out more, he's talking about adult use, like, maybe that's okay too. I see a lot of states have been doing it. So he's kind of looks like he's relaxing a little bit on that. So I think we could just expect more of the same momentum, whatever good momentum that we get on rescheduling or descheduling or whatever happens. I think that it'll be supportive. And what I really like about Trump's approach is that it is small government, low regulation, low taxation, pro-business. And so I think that will be huge for the success of the development of the cannabis industry too, to have better business practices in place.
Well, it's clear that without real federal action, the industry globally is going to have more difficulty. That's just abundantly clear. There's a lack of institutional lending. There's a lack of clarity for law enforcement, for business owners, whether it's employment, whether it's, there are a million interstate commerce, labeling, standards, all those things. There are great difficulties And quite frankly, these were things that most people that got into the industry expected to be resolved by then. We'll have to see whether or not those that are champions for the industry stand behind, their positions and actually make something happen. We're all hopeful because for this industry to survive, there has to be some sort of federal reform. Otherwise, the state by state patchwork approach, it's kind of half a loaf. It's not getting these businesses the clarity they need to survive, and it's generally not good for consumers and for patients. We're at the end of our time, but I'm certainly open. If anyone has any questions, you.
This letter to the DEA so that they can testify at this rescheduling hearing. Those letters are due like the 25th of this month. And I'm just curious,
Do you know, Bryon?
Yeah, I know Jason Ortiz from Last Prisoner Project. He'd asked me about it, and I think he's putting a group together to do this. So he would be, if anybody's interested, he would be a good person to contact.
Well, there may be Freedom of Information Act requests that you can make. Those may be publicly available. I'd have to think about how they wouldn't be, but I haven't looked into that. I mean, it's entirely possible that those are accessible to everyone in this room.
Can anyone speak to a proposed bill federally or at the state level to remove intoxicating hemp products from the hemp bill?
In the Congress or
Well, I've heard, I've read a couple of articles about this happening at the federal level. There's those bills.
the Mary Miller Amendment?
Yeah. State levels have talked about.
Yeah, I haven't been following the Mary Miller thing because it's so early on and we've got such a long ways to go on the Farm Bill negotiation. But at the state level, that's all going to go down next session. There'll be pre-filing of bills here in November. And there's definitely going to be a concerted effort to either regulate or maybe outright ban. And yeah, intoxicating is not the right word to use. So there'll be different lobby groups working on this, definitely to try to salvage and to keep some inartful language from appearing and wiping out, unintentionally wiping out a huge swath of products. That's what could happen.
We've, D4DPR has written a policy paper on this in terms of the need to regulate, but not ban these products. It's crazy what we've gotten ourselves into, but we just don't believe in prohibition. It doesn't work.
And actually, we do have some regulation. We just don't have enough manpower to go around and enforce it. So people think it's as if there's no regulation. I believe there's 8,000 licensed stores in the state. So there's probably 20,000 retailers. So.
Yeah, there are 8,000 locations. And I think the testimony was next year they'll have 12 full-time employees policing those. But I think the discussion is...
There's one guy for all of Houston, Galveston.
But the discussion is whether, there's an argument about whether or not the certain isomers should be allowed of Delta-9 THC. That's, to me, will be a topic discussed not just in Texas, but likely in every state legislature, I would expect. Well, with that, we'll stick around. And if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them and happy to meet and chat. And thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to put this on for you.